Okay, continuing from where we left off last class. Last time we talked about purpose adverbial clause. So today we're going to talk about contrast and concession adverbial clause. So some of you may not be familiar with the word concession. This is actually quite often in persuasive text. When we are making concession, we are partially acknowledging with the opposing view. So what does that mean? It means that today, if we're talking about whether we should legalize marijuana in Taiwan, the other person said, no, we shouldn't. I said, yes, we should. But I'm not going to say you're completely wrong and I'm completely right. I'm going to make concession. I'm going to say, yeah, of course, I think you're partially right. Even though in certain cases it makes sense that we should ban marijuana, probably because of traffic problems, probably because of road safety, I'm going to shift back to my own claim. Still, I believe that legalizing marijuana, allowing people to choose whether or not they want to smoke weed, should be the better option. Okay, and that is what we call making concession, partially acknowledging the other party's point of view. So we have contrast or opposition subordinators, whereas and while. Keep in mind that sometimes subordinators can have multifunction. So when we first talk about time subordinators, while can also mean happening at the same time, but it can also be used for contrast. Okay, so we take a look at the example sentences. San Francisco is cool during the summer, whereas Los Angeles is generally hot. These two clauses are directly opposing one another, right? And we have to make sure that our subordinator is followed by subject verb, always followed by a clause. And the second example, while most homes in San Francisco do not have air conditioning, right? While is our subordinator, like whereas. Homes is our subject, cross out prepositional phrase, and do have is our verb. So remember, we said that not is not a verb. It modifies the verb, so it is actually adverb function. Okay, so while most homes do not have air conditioning, it is a necessity in Los Angeles. Now, if you've been paying attention to our punctuation rule, you would notice something different. Usually, when our independent clause comes first, like San Francisco is cool, and our dependent clause comes after, like whereas Los Angeles is hot, we would not need a comma because our general punctuation rule for adverbial clause is independent plus dependent and dependent plus introducer comma and independent. However, whenever you are making contrast, you have to add comma before your opposition subordinators. It doesn't matter whether the independent comes first or second. Okay, so that's one important rule. So same thing with concession. Sometimes for concession, because people think it means contrast, so oftentimes they would add a comma before the concession subordinators as well. So now let's take a look at concession subordinators. We have although, even though, and though. So I want to put a star sign next to though, because though is very special. Later on, we will also talk about the difference between though and however. So just keep in mind for now that our though can be used as a subordinator, like even though and although, but sometimes it can be used as conjunctive adverb, like however and nevertheless. But let's take a look. Although I had studied all night, I failed the test. So we can see our dependent clause comes first and that is why there is an introducer comma. And make sure for Taiwanese students, Chinese-speaking students, I know you like to say although, even though, and but. In English, that is not acceptable because our rule is comma fanboys equals semicolon equals period. So if you add a but after comma, essentially you're creating a fragment. You're using a period function after your dependent clause. All right. In our second example, our house is quite comfortable even though it is small. So for some people or some grammar textbooks, they would actually accept a comma here simply because they think this is making contrast. All right, but even if you don't have the comma, that is correct as well. Okay, and though as a subordinator is least formal. So when you're writing academic papers or your essays, try to prioritize using although and even though, okay? And as you can see here, our dependent clause comes first. So there is an introducer comma followed by our independent clause. So now we are going to take a look at our example sentences. The first one has been done for us already. Modern Olympic equestrian, which is horse racer, events emphasize style. The ancient Greek events emphasize speed. So we know one emphasizes style, the other emphasizes speed. So that is contrast. So they use comma, whereas, or you can also use while. All right, and for number 2, both the common cold and the flu are caused by viruses. Only the flu can be prevented through immunization. So this is actually not opposition. Instead, this is concession. So we should be using even though, although, or though, right? So I can say, even though both the common cold and the flu are caused by viruses, introducer comma, only the flu can be prevented through immunization. And that's it. Number 3. A cold develops gradually, and any fever that develops will be low grade. The flu often comes on abruptly. So right away, do you see this is direct opposition? Gradually and abruptly. So instead of retyping the entire sentence, I'm just going to use comma, while. That is direct opposition. And I have to change the capital T to lowercase. Number 4, Ludwig van Beethoven became totally deaf in midlife. He wrote some of the Western world's greatest music. So again, this is not direct opposition. Instead, this is concession. Okay, so I should use even though or although, and I'm not going to retype the whole thing. Although Beethoven became totally deaf, comma, introducer comma, he wrote some of the best music. And South Korea is becoming an economic superpower. It is a small country with few natural resources. So this is concession again, not opposition. So I should use even though or although. So I'm simply going to add although here. So now you might be wondering, how do I decide where to add my subordinator? Do I add it to the first clause or the second clause? You have to make sure that your main idea is your independent clause. And so your minor idea is the one with the subordinator. So in the example of number 5, South Korea is becoming an economic superpower. That is your main idea, and that is why it should be your independent clause. Okay, and that's it for opposition and Concession. I will see you next time.